Okay, so we have two Bible books to cover in a day. So we can go a couple different directions with it. We'll see how much time we have. There is a final project I'm going to have you guys work on in class. I want to give a lot of time to that. So we may or may not make it through all the way through Leviticus and Numbers. That's just the nature of a short week. But I do want to start the conversation out with something a little bit broader. So there's a field of study that is just often referred to as biblical interpretation. There's a fancy word for that, which is hermeneutics. But I want to start off with a conversation about interpretation, because biblical interpretation essentially deals with the question of where is meaning found, and how do we then find it? How do we go about discovering meaning? And there's three main theories regarding where meaning is found, and you're going to see this in various academics and books. Some of these theories are kind of like non-evangelical. You tend to find them more in liberal circles. Some you find in conservative circles. But there's really only three options. When you're dealing with a text, a written document of some kind, meaning has to be found somewhere, and where do you find it? So the three theories are this: that you find meaning in the text, or you find meaning in the author, or you find meaning in the reader. Okay? Now, what's that last one mean? Anyone have any idea when you say meaning is found in the reader? What do you think that's indicating?
The feeling you get.
The feeling you get, right? What you bring to it. Has anyone ever sat around? Sometimes churches fall into this and they don't even realize, and sometimes really good churches fall into this and they don't realize they're falling into it. They have a small group Bible study, they meet in somebody's living room, there's a passage, somebody reads it, and then they go around in a circle and they say, what does that passage mean to you, right? So they and you say, well, that's a liberal hermeneutic. Oh, we're not liberal, we're a super conservative church, and they probably are. But they've fallen into the idea that meaning, not application, but actual meaning, what this actually means, is found in the mind of the reader. And by the way, in liberal scholarship, this is probably the dominant view right now, right? That meaning is not found in the text. The text contains no inherent meaning whatsoever. The meaning is not found in the author. He's dead, so it doesn't matter anyway. But meaning can only be found in the reader. What are some potential problems with that? Right. I mean, what control mechanism do you have? Because your meaning is going to be different than your meaning, which is going to be different than your meaning. And by the way, they would say, yeah, that's exactly right. It's going to be different for everybody. Which then reduces it to utter nonsense, right? If something means everything, then it means essentially nothing. So, by the way, you can have a combination of these things. I'm not saying that they're mutually exclusive. The other idea is that meaning is found in the author. One way of putting that is authorial intent, or the author's intent, what the author intended to say. What is a potential, or at least a claimed problem with that? Any ideas?
If you're deciding what the author meant.
Well, yeah, I mean, particularly if they're not around to ask, right? So you can go to a living author who wrote a book of fiction. I think I've already mentioned Harry Potter as an example the other day. Like, she's still alive. We can go and ask her what she meant by certain passages, right? So, okay, that's good. I can't go to Jane Austen, who wrote a lot of classic works. She's long dead. Well, what did you mean by this? Well, who am I going to ask? I could ask her descendants, but that's not going to be super helpful. They're not her, right? Can't ask Paul, can't ask Moses, can't ask David. I mean, so authorial intent has the inherent weakness that if you don't have the author, if this is the only place where meaning is found, you got a bit of a problem. So I actually had a master's level student that was grading his paper earlier this morning, and he wrote a paper on 1 Kings. The Bible doesn't tell us who the author of 1 and 2 Kings is. It's an anonymous work. And his claim was, since we don't know who the author was, we do not know the purpose for which 1 and 2 Kings was written. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? Who agrees with that statement? Since we do not know who the author was, and of course his view is the author, that's where you find meaning. Since we do not know who the author was, we cannot know the purpose for which 1 and 2 Kings is written. Who agrees with it? Who disagrees with it? Why do you disagree with that?
Because,
Go ahead.
because the meaning isn't found via the author. You look through the text to decipher what it's talking about.
So even if we knew who the author was, for example, Ephesians, we know who the author is. Romans, we know who the author is. So where do we go to find out about the Apostle Paul? In where? The text that usually he wrote. Now we also have the one that Luke wrote, which is Acts. You can find out a little bit about him there. But there's no external source. There's no biography that you can go to. Josephus didn't write a biography of the Apostle Paul just so we could have that information. Even if we say that meaning is found in the author, where do you discover information about the author? Generally speaking, you discover that in the text, right? And so typically speaking, although authorial intent's massive, right? So this is why a conservative interpretation or hermeneutic is going to say meaning is found in the text, but that has to be controlled to some degree by authorial intent. In other words, the meaning that we derive out of that should be close to, as close as humanly possible, should be close to what the author was actually trying to communicate in that particular thing, right? So authorial intent is massively important. So if Paul didn't mean to say something, then if we find that hidden meaning in the text, it's probably a wrong meaning, right? Because he's writing something for a reason. If you wrote this paper and you turned in a paper to me on your outline of Leviticus, and I said, well, this is a great outline of the book of Ruth. Thanks for turning that in. And you're like, no, it's about Leviticus. No, I hear what you said, but I think it's an outline of the book of Ruth. My position would be nonsensical, right? It wouldn't even match the text that you wrote, and it clearly wouldn't match your intent for which you wrote to begin with. So authorial intent is important, the text is important. Now, the reason I bring that up is when it comes to the text, texts are given to us in genres, right? We talked about that a little bit the other day. So we talked about a really kind of a small one, the law code genre, which a lot of people aren't familiar with, big ones that people are familiar with, poetry, prophecy, narrative / story, whatever word you want to use for that, letters, like all of those things are various genres. And since a text is bound in those things, the genre impacts and affects meaning. And so I want to give you, introduce a new, it's not a genre, but it's a literary style or device that's used. There's a lot of literary devices that are used that we use in our everyday speech. I look at see a big buck on a trail cam. I'm like, man, that was a killer buck. I'm probably not saying he's a serial killer that goes around murdering people. That's probably not what I mean. But so I'm using the word killer in a hyperbolic way, right? And everybody knows what I mean by that when I say that, right? Well, yeah, very rarely do you run into someone who thinks, Josh just said there's a serial killer animal in the woods. No, we recognize it's hyperbole. Hyperbole is a literary device. When Jesus says you have to hate your father and mother in order to be a follower of me, literal or hyperbolic? Hyperbolic, clearly hyperbolic. I mean, you'd have to be sort of mentally checked out or just being incredibly disingenuous to make some other claim, although some people have been very disingenuous and made that claim, right? But clearly he's being hyperbolic in that particular situation. I want to introduce another one to you. So this comes from Mark 2:27, where Jesus says, man was not made for the Sabbath. Okay? How's the rest of that go? But the Sabbath was made for man. This is a literary style. It's a literary device known as a chiasm. Kind of old, silly Greek word. Chiasm means cross or crossing, right? And so literally there's a crossing that occurs. You've got, man was not made for the, no, I reversed that, didn't I? The Sabbath was not made for man. That's how it goes. I actually made this heretical. I didn't mean to do that. So Sabbath was not made for Man, am I doing this right? Sabbath was not made for. I had it right the first time. So man was, I can't even think straight today. Okay. So you've got a crossing. You've got Sabbath. It's a reversal taking place in the text. You see how he flipped everything around, right, to make a point? We do that all the time. You can take a girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl, right? So we use chiasms constantly in our modern day speech. John F. Kennedy, the former president, he did this quite a bit. He used chiasms actually quite often and quite effectively in his speech. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It's an example of a chiasm. So we see chiasms on the sentence level. And by the way, these things are found all throughout Scripture. Jesus used those a couple different times. Other authors use those a couple different times. And a chiasm can control a paragraph. A chiasm can control a huge chunk of a book. And a chiasm can be the structure of an entire book, right? That happened particularly in the Old Testament all the time. There are chiasms everywhere in the text. When the reason I bring this up to you is because, again, the issue is meaning. And if we say meaning is found in the text, then that meaning is found on both we could call it the micro level and the macro level. So by micro level, I mean the sentence that it's found in, the verse that it's found in, the paragraph that it's found in. So when we talk about, you guys, some of you were joking at breakfast, I could do all things through a verse taken out of context. Well, so what's the context? Well, usually what we mean by that is, well, it's at the very least, it's the verses surrounding it, for crying out loud, right? I mean, that's the micro level meaning, which is really the default meaning where we should go, right? If you really want to understand what something's happening, you have to at least, that first step is, what's the few verses before, what's the few verses after? What paragraph is it found in? What chapter is it found in? What's going on in that entire chapter? That's the microstructure. There's also a macro structure, and the macro structure sometimes is not as easy to discern, and you only see it as you begin reading through it, and the text itself never necessarily overtly points to it. An example of that, a really good example of that, is the Gospel of Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew, you have, I'm going to give you the rough kind of overview of how he presents Jesus. You have the birth of Jesus, of course, taking place in Matthew. But then you have the slaughter of infants recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. Herod finds out that there is a boy who's going to be born, who is rumored to be a coming king. He's threatened by that. So he goes out and tries to eliminate that king by slaughtering all of the little boys. Does that story remind you of anything? Moses. Okay, right. So Moses in the basket. Why is he in the basket? Because Pharaoh was slaughtering a bunch of kids, right? All right, so okay, that's a neat coincidence. But right now we're just on the coincidence level, that's it. Well, very next thing we find out, Joseph and Mary go down to Egypt. They take Jesus with them. And so Jesus, quite literally, eventually, as he gets older, comes up from Egypt and out of Egypt. Well, again, who does that remind you of? Well, Jews, but what person does that remind you of? Moses. Again, Moses. We got that's kind of another interesting coincidence we have. And Matthew does that over and over and over and over again in the Gospel of Matthew. And then, of course, finally it culminates. There's the Sermon on the Mount, right, where he gives the new law, the law of Christ. And so you have this emerging picture on a macro level that's presenting Jesus as the new Moses. But Matthew never says that. There's no verse in Matthew where it says, oh, by the way, look at this on a bigger picture level, and kind of what I'm doing is I'm showing you that Jesus is the new Moses. He just never says that. However, it seems to be an intentional hearkening back to Deuteronomy 18, where Moses, or the text there talks about a prophet like Moses who's going to come someday, right? And by the way, when Joshua takes over, the text is very clear. It's not Joshua, because it says that Joshua only receives some, actually uses the word some in Hebrew, some of Moses' authority. So even though Joshua is clearly the new leader, the text itself makes it very clear that he is not the one that Deuteronomy 18 was talking about. There's still another leader coming at some point in the future. And the Old Testament kind of drops that. You never ever hear about it again until you get to the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 3, where Peter very overtly says, Jesus is the new Moses, right? So he's the one like Moses that was prophesied and promised. So you have meaning in the Gospel of Matthew is found on a micro level, right, in the individual verses. But if we're going to be true to the text, because again, text is where we find meaning, there's something that emerges on the macro level that shows us another layer and dimension of meaning. That's, by the way, being controlled by the text. This isn't, hey, kind of what are you seeing? What am I seeing? I think you're seeing this. I think I'm seeing that. It's not fanciful. It's not imaginative. Macro meaning is still grounded in things that we're actually seeing occurring in the text itself, but it's on a bigger structural level, right? Now, that might get complicated, that might get heady. The reason I bring that up is because we're going to see that in the book of Leviticus. Again, I use the word chiasm. We see a chiasm happening in the book of Leviticus, where you have a crossing, or maybe another way of putting it is a intentional repetition of ideas. And the chiasm can have as many layers as it needs to. In fact, there's some very complicated chiasms in the Old Testament with like 15, 16 different layers that's there. This is actually a fairly simple one, where on this first level, it's in the first 7 chapters, it's all about sacrifices for the people. All the various sacrifices that the people have to do. They come together as individuals or as a community, and they offer these various sacrifices. And then you return to the for the people or of the people theme again in the last few chapters, where now the focus of the conversation is on the festivals and the vows of the people, right? So it's kind of a layered thing. We're kind of returning to a theme again. And we see that again on the B level. The B level is all about the priesthood. Here it's about the appointing of priests and the establishment of the priesthood. Chapters 8 and 9, and chapter 10 is a disastrous story of people who essentially tried to seize the priesthood on their own authority, and then all that kind of comes with that, right? But the B level, the first B level, is all about the establishment of the priesthood. And this ends in chapter 10, but we don't pick up the priests again until chapter 21, where it returns to that theme. But now the whole focus is on priestly holiness, right? So we've got to return to the A level, we've got to return to the B level, and the C level is all about ritual purity. Don't touch a dead body. All of these things that you become ceremonially or ritually unclean if you do or come in contact with something or whatever else it might happen to be. And this is some of the ones that we get a little uncomfortable reading about, like menstrual cycles, things like that. That information is all found here on ritual purity. Now, it doesn't say ritual purity, it just uses the word purity, right? So here's the purity laws, okay? That theme is returned to again a little bit later on, but here the focus is on moral purity, right? So these are the laws about sexual ethics, about murder, about these more moral commands, right? It's not the ritualistic unclean. Oh, I came in contact with a dead body, now I'm ritualistically unclean. It's, no, you committed adultery, right? And that's a big deal, right? So the whole focus is on that. And in the very center of the chiasm is this whole chapter on the Day of Atonement, on our basic need to be made right before God, because we're not right before God, and yet we need to be, right? Day of Atonement becomes a big deal. It's broad, it's expansive. It's this corporate, national, as well as individual call. Works is every layer is deeply meaningful and significant. But if we think of this as an arrow, where is the arrow pointing in the chiasm? To the center, to the Day of Atonement. This is the way all chiasms work in the Old Testament. The arrow always points to the center, right? And it does so intentionally. It's not saying that this is the most important thing. It is saying that this is the hinge or the key to which the entire structure revolves around, right? You can't make sense of any of the other layers unless you make sense of the center layer. And this was a very common and very Hebrew way of writing documents in the ancient world. Your Old Testament Bible, whether you know it or not, because it's harder to see in English, is chocked full of chiasms. In fact, there's a really cool book called The Literary Structure of the Old Testament, which just goes from beginning to end in the Old Testament. It just shows you all the chiasms that are there. Small chiasms in a chapter, big chiasms in an entire book.
Is that the actual title of the book?
I think I'll double check that. I believe it is the actual title, but I will, during the break, I'll double check to make sure that's I think the author's last name is Dorsey. I'll double check that too. I'm to the point in life that book titles and authors are blending together in my head pretty bad. So now, but it does something. It's not just, oh, that's cool. I mean, okay, we match it, 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 we match it. It's kind of neat. It's doing more than being just neat, right? It's more than just a structure. It's a structure. Remember I said there's macro meaning and micro meaning, right? Micro meaning is the chapter, the paragraph, the verse. Macro meaning is meaning that emerges out of the structure of the work as a whole. This has meaning. It's trying to say something to you. Without overtly saying it in a verse, it's still communicating truth to you. Because there's a difference between this section and this section. And the difference between those two sections is our need for atonement. Let me walk you through that a little bit. Essentially, what this is saying is, all right, we got a lot of detail in chapters 1 through 7. Some of this detail is actually fairly horrific. I'm like, this is how you rip out the entrails of the dove. Well, thank you, Moses, for that information. Okay, so, but you have all, and then you have like grain offerings, you have all these various offerings that are there. But let me ask you a question. What good is offering sacrifices if you don't have a heart of joy and a commitment of obedience to the Lord? This is exactly why a later prophet said, listen, God doesn't want your sacrifices. It's ultimately not what he wants. What does God want? He wants your heart. He wants your obedience. That's what he wants. He wants your love. He wants your devotion. And even though there's not a crystal clear verse, the way a later prophet actually gives us a crystal clear verse, I'm going to argue that the text of Leviticus is saying the exact same thing. That the sacrifices don't mean anything without an atonement or being made right before the Lord, so that one has a joy of and a commitment to God. So apart from that relationship of joy, your sacrifices really don't mean that much at all, right? Same thing is happening on the B level. You've got the ordination and the invention of and the commissioning of priests, so all the various rules that come along with it. You have a tragic story of how that goes really wrong really fast, which brings up the issue of we need to be right before the Lord, but what good is a priesthood if that priesthood is not going to be holy? What good are elders in your church if your elders aren't committed to the Word of God? What good is your pastor if he's not committed to the Word? In fact, if your elders and your pastor isn't committed to the Word of God, I guarantee the church is going to end up disastrous, right? Same thing happening here. I mean, yeah, you can have the priesthood all day long, but if that priesthood isn't holy, and how do we become holy? Well, our need for atonement is driving us to make sure that we're holy before God. And the same thing with the C level is, okay, yeah, we can make an argument that ritual purity is important, at least it was important in the Old Testament world, but what good is making sure that you avoid contact with a dead body if you're sleeping with your mother-in-law, right? When you're like, that's kind of grotesquely specific. Well, the Bible does get grotesquely specific sometimes. In fact, Leviticus gets grotesquely specific for a reason. It's because it's like, and this is where when Jesus later on in the New Testament accuses the Pharisees of being whitewashed tombs, this is what he's pointing to. He's saying, you are so focused on this. You've made that the most important thing. And Jesus is essentially saying, you're misreading the entirety of Leviticus. You're not even reading it the way Leviticus is intending to be understood. Because if you read the book as a literary unit with literary intentionality, the fancy word for that is rhetorical aim. Like what the rhetoric, what the literature is aiming to accomplish or intending to accomplish. If you read Leviticus according to its rhetorical aim, it's saying, yeah, this is not nothing, but it's nowhere as important as this, right? even though it uses the exact same word. It uses the word purity, And often what we're going to find, particularly in social media, in liberalism, and people who are deconstructing from their faith, when you bring up like a topic like homosexuality, for example, which is forbidden in Leviticus chapter 18, again in chapter 20, they're going to say, yeah, but you can't cite it from Leviticus because, yeah, it says you're not supposed to be a homosexual, but it also says that you can't mix types of clothing too, right? And so you're just picking and choosing different verses in Leviticus. So if you're going to forbid homosexuality, you also have to forbid polyester, right? Or, mixed clothing of any kind, or you can't eat shellfish any longer, or you can't eat pork. And if you are eating pork and you do have mixed clothing in, and I guarantee everybody here probably, unless you're wearing 100% wool, you're probably wearing mixed clothing of some kind, you're in violation of the ritual purity laws, and they say, aha, you're violating Leviticus, when they're misunderstanding the macro meaning of the literature itself, where this is important in Leviticus, but Leviticus itself is pointing to the priority of this. So when Jesus comes in the New Testament, and he says, Sabbath is not made for man, but man's made for Sabbath, and rebukes the Pharisees for saying, listen, you have all of these rules about how far you can walk on a Sabbath or on a Saturday, but, you're not caring about the poor and the suffering around you. He's not reinventing the law. He's not chucking the law. He's not disagreeing with the law. Jesus is saying this is the whole reason of the law when it was originally given. The original authorial intent, the textual meaning of the law in Leviticus prioritizes the second half of the chiasm over the first half of the chiasm. Sacrifice is clearly important. Doesn't matter if you don't love God. Just doesn't. In fact, a later prophet will go so far to say, speaking for the Lord, I hate your worship. I hate your songs. They are detestable to me. Yeah. It is Amos. I hate it. Singing your worship songs, right? The Lord actually says that to his people. Is it because he doesn't want worship songs? Is it because he doesn't want sacrifices? No, it's because this has always been the priority. Jesus didn't reinvent that. Jesus is reminding us of the original message of the Old Testament law, right? So again, this is just one example of how we can misunderstand Scripture when we don't understand the literature that's taking place, right? And there's micro meaning and there's macro meaning. But we run into this one all the time, constantly, because of the sexuality things that are going on currently in culture. You can't forbid homosexuality. If you do, you're a hypocrite because you're not forbidding pork, right?
What do you say to people who say that passage in Leviticus is mistranslated from and I don't necessarily agree with this, but they say it's man shall not lay with child.
So usually what they do, it's not the Hebrew word they're talking about the Greek word in the New Testament. And so the Greek word in the New Testament, they're saying that word, originally that word was referring to like a man-child relationship. That's actually technically not true. If we want to get into the specifics, maybe from a broader view at least, that Greek word does assume a power dynamic of some kind, right? It's not man-child. That's definitely not true. That's just blatantly false. But in the ancient world, homosexuality, and this, I hate to get too specific and too gross, but the Roman world was gross, okay? If you go back, if you guys ever hear of Seneca, for example, the Roman senator, he wrote documents. Tacitus, a Roman historian, he wrote documents. They openly didn't brag about, but they talked about pedophilia like it was normal. It was a normal thing to do. You didn't hide it, right? No one's going to arrest you for that. If anything, the police chief would compliment you for that. That was just the world in which you lived in. And of course, homosexuality, again, it was a very normal thing. Now, there was norms. You were still expected to have a wife and be a good Roman and have kids. But you could be a homosexual on the side, you could be a pedophile on the side, and nobody cared in the Roman world. So homosexuality in the Roman world was a power dynamic issue. And so then you would have the more dominant partner. And again, this is where the graphicness comes into play, and that's not what I'm trying to do, but you'd have the more dominant partner, and then you would have the more submissive partner in that homosexual dynamic. And so the Greek word that was used was a word that kind of had that power dynamic built into it, because that's the only version of homosexuality that they saw, which then becomes an argument for some modern, more left-leaning Christians of, but the ancient world didn't have anything that looked like a man and a man together in a monogamous married relationship, which is true. The ancient world did not know what that was. It couldn't have conceived of that. Ergo, this must be okay, right? Because this is loving, this is consensual, this is between two adults, therefore this should be okay. The problem with that is that verbiage that we see, particularly in Leviticus, doesn't use that language. Leviticus is a man who lies with a man. I don't care who's the dominant partner, who's the submissive partner. I don't care how young he is, how old he is. I don't care if it's your best friend. I don't care if you're married to the guy. A man shall not lie with a man. Like, so it's just more sort of generic, all-encompassing language that's there. And in the New Testament, Paul's just using really the only term available for homosexuality in his day, which was the Greek term that he uses, right? You also tend to see a lot of times this went viral on TikTok a while ago, that the word homosexual didn't appear in the Bible until like 1957, or I forget what the year was, which is true, but that's because America coined the term homosexual about 20 years prior to that, right? So it was a new word that came in, and it became the dominant way of referring to that kind of a relationship. And Bible translations, their goal is to take the ancient language and replicate it in the what? Modern language. So if your modern language keeps shifting and changing, this is why you have updates to Bible translations every so often, because they're trying to keep up with the way words are being used today. But what that little thing also forgets, the word doesn't appear until 1957, is that before 1957, another word appeared at the time that actually meant that. Often it was sodomite. So that was a typical Bible translation for the time. They just leave that detail out of their little TikTok videos. Yes, it is a new word, but it's a new word that replaced an old word that really meant the same thing, right?
And on top of that, like, the word "the" wasn't in the Bible until a certain date because it wasn't in English.
Right.
Like, just because that word wasn't in doesn't mean the idea wasn't.
Yeah, we invent words all the time,
Yeah.
right? So constantly we do that. So this is just an example of, again, when you're reading Scripture, we can't get into a deep dive of what hermeneutics is or biblical interpretation methods are in this particular class, but when you're reading through Scripture, when we say meaning is based on the author's intent and meaning is found in the text, we take that very seriously. So we want to take the text seriously for what it says. We want to take the text seriously for the type of literature that it is, because the type of literature impacts meaning, right? So meaning is found on a micro level, meaning is found on a macro level, right? Again, like Ecclesiastes. So Ecclesiastes is have you guys ever read Ecclesiastes? Super depressing book. Super depressing. Like, if you're thinking suicidal thoughts, not the book to go to. Really is not the book to go to. Right? And I know we're kind of joking around about that, but I'm dead serious. Not the book to go to in those moments. What's the purpose of living? I don't know why we're even alive. We shouldn't be alive. I should just die today. I don't know what the point of this is. Right? The entire book is like that. At the very end, I still don't know what the point of life is, but I guess I'm just going to keep reading scriptures because I don't know. I don't know what it's about. And that's how it ends. That's how the book ends. Now, is that making a truth claim that we should be the kind of people that walk around saying, I don't know why we're even alive and this whole thing is pointless? Is that the rhetorical aim of Ecclesiastes? Well, what's the rhetorical aim of Ecclesiastes then? Okay, right? But did he have God or did he not have God? Yeah, but he still says there's no point to life.
Like, a lot of it was when he was turning away from God and then saying how come it's like,
Maybe, but does the text tell us that?
I guess it's kind of implied of like the way he was living his life.
So here's the thing. The same author who wrote Ecclesiastes wrote what other books? Proverbs. Proverbs is pretty happy. There's some negative stuff here and there. But it's pretty, hey, raise up a child in the way he will go. And when he's old, he's not going to depart from it. That's a pretty cool verse for parents, you know. When your kid's 2, that verse is awesome. When your kid's a 19-year-old jerk, it's not as cool, right? And then you're like, what in the world happened? Like, we tried to be good parents, and all of a sudden he just kind of went off on his own. I thought God gave me a promise. And by the way, that's a misunderstanding too. Proverbs are not promises, they're truisms. In other words, if you do this, this is how your life will usually go, right? More often than not, if you raise your child well, your child's going to turn out well. More often than not. Proverbs is the book for when life goes well. Ecclesiastes is the book for when life doesn't go well. You might be doing, so this is, you could be right. Solomon clearly, because we know a lot of other information about Solomon, and that guy was up and down spiritually. So he brought a lot of negative to the equation as well, but it wasn't all Solomon that brought negative to his life. That's not the full explanation for why life didn't go well for him. The other part of it is because life often just doesn't go well, right? You can live a righteous life and you might still get cancer. You can be the perfect parents and your kids still might reject Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, right? And so this happens over and over. One of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament that we know about was Samuel. Samuel's 2 boys were jerks spiritually that walked away from the Lord, right? And just so we see this happening over and over and over again. So what's the point of Ecclesiastes? Ecclesiastes is not trying to get you to be the person who's depressed. It's trying to get you to be the person that even when you are depressed, you cling to God. That's what it's trying to get you to be. But notice there's no verse that says that anywhere. But that's the structure. That's the style of literature that it is. So the only way we come to that conclusion is by recognizing a macro level of meaning for Ecclesiastes, right? It's this dejected individual whose life has not went well, and he can find no meaning, whereas when life was going a little bit better, he was able to see a lot of meaning and purpose and value and warmth and beauty. But he's at a moment in his life where he just can't see that right now, right? So micro level and macro level. Okay, what time do we have? 11:44. Okay, we have a lot we need to do, so we're not going to get into the book Numbers. It's a really cool book. Numbers is where we find everything that Israel does wrong and wicked and rebellious is found in the book Numbers. It's sprinkled throughout the rest of the books as well, but that is their wilderness journey, physically, literally in a wilderness. But the bigger problem with Israel is they're in a spiritual wilderness because they are, frankly, not only not focusing on this, they're probably not even focusing on this to a large degree either. They're just completely walking away from God entirely. Okay, with that said, we are going to switch gears to the final exam-ish project that we're doing. So we're going to take a 15-minute break. What time did we say it was? 9:55? 9:45. All right, so let's come back at 10. But when you come back in 10, I think there's 16 people in the room, if I counted. I'm not a math. Team up in groups of 8, because we need 2 teams when you come back, and we're going to hit the ground rolling for our final exam group project that you're going to be working on, okay?
Can we bring our books and stuff? I should leave them out.
What's that?
Can we bring our books in here? Or should we leave them out? The last.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be open book, open Bible for the thing that we're doing, so, yeah. All right, take your break. Get into your groups.